Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second high-level panel of this conference. We want to welcome all of you who are attending from all around the world. This has been a really exciting couple of days, really informative, and really just a wonderful program. This second high-level panel of the conference is also focusing on science policy measures to protect human health from emerging water pollutants. My name is Gabriel Eckstein. I'm a professor at the Texas A&M University, and along with, I will be co-moderating this session along with Christopher Fischer. He is an analyst with the World Bank and co-founder and executive editor of Water Science Policy, which is the water-focused news and information platform. We also have with us Tatiana Dmitrieva as the rapporteur for the session. She's a consultant with the Groundwater System and Human Settlement section at UNESCO. I'm going to turn over to Chris right now for some general housekeeping information for the audience.
Thanks so much, Gabriel, and welcome everyone. There is a lot of housekeeping in the chat as well, so you can go back to that at any point regarding the recording. It is recorded, and we encourage you to submit Q&A throughout the session, and then there is a dedicated section towards the end on Q&A where we'll try to answer as many as possible in this session. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Other than that, the chat is disabled, so please use the Q&A to engage with the panel. You can also get subtitles and, of course, try to email the online.conference@iwra.org for any immediate assistance as needed. Thanks so much and look forward to a great session.
All right, so we're going to get started. I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have with us Dr. Joan Rose, who's a professor at Michigan State University and co-director of two centers, the Center for Water Science for Water Sciences and the Center for Advancing Microbial Risk Assessment. She is also the 2016 recipient of the Stockholm Water Prize. We have with us Mohamed El Banni, an academic and researcher in molecular toxicology with the University of Sousse and the Higher Institute of Biotechnology, Monastir in Tunisia. We also have Cindy Wallis-Lage she's the former president of the global water business and also the former executive director for sustainability and resilience for the engineering firm Black & Veatch. And finally, we have Bruce Allan Gordon, who's the unit head of water, sanitation, hygiene, and health at the World Health Organization. So we're going to just dive right in, and I'm going to be asking all of the panelists here this first question. And just a reminder, we're going to try to keep the flow going. So to the extent we can, keep responses short and maybe engage in a conversation. So to all the panelists, given your knowledge of and experience with emerging pollutants, what keeps you up at night? We've heard throughout this conference all sorts of concerns and challenges about emerging pollutants of all sorts of types, whether micropollutants or PFAS, pharmaceuticals, and so on. I mean, what is your greatest concern? And I'd like to start with Dr. Rose, please.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me at this important conference. Well, what keeps me up at night is really looking into a parent's eyes and saying that their child has died from contaminated drinking water. And I've been in outbreak situations before where I've had to do that, and that is just devastating. And really, I feel it's because we have not done enough in terms of monitoring both our surface waters, our source waters, and our drinking water. And in particular, I think groundwater has been neglected. And so I'm hoping that there's going to be much more attention paid to pathogen pollution. All it takes is a single glass of water with a single microorganism, deadly organism, to cause this kind of devastation. And so I hope that we don't forget that we really need to pay attention to this type of pathogen pollution.
All right, thank you. Dr. Banni, same question to you.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. From myself, also what makes me up at night is the lack of awareness, I think, regarding some emerging pollutants. And one of the most concerning for me is microplastic in drinking water. Unfortunately, I think the information are very lacking in terms of how many particles are we drinking every day when we have a glass of water, especially from water that is enabled in plastic bottles. So this is really very, very concerning for me. And moreover, when I'm studying the presence of this microplastic in cells, in human cells, and we did found a lot of them in many tissue, which are also very correlated with some pathologies, coming pathologies. So this is really very concerning for me. The key word will be the lack of awareness regarding microplastic in drinking water, but not only drinking water, all kind of food that we are consuming every day. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to same question to Ms. Cindy Wallis-Lage. You're coming from an industry perspective into this into our conversation, and so from your perspective, what keeps you up at night?
Thank you for the opportunity to join this great panel. Love hearing from all of you. You know, for me, it's the speed in which we identify a pollutant's impact, and then we develop sustainable solutions to it. The contaminants that have been put into this EC category, they've been around in many cases for centuries. You can look back at even just some that we started off with. You look at lead, you can look at asbestos, and you can see the time it took to identify that really was a health problem, and it was a challenge that we had to deal with before we could actually take meaningful action. And currently, I think of comment was made about PFAS. It's a high priority, but we've known about the issues for decades. I can think about the time and the conversations that we've had on this, but we don't have sustainable solutions. We don't have solutions that are going to be easily implemented. We have challenges where we're transforming it from the water to a waste, and now we have a soil challenge, and then we get into another challenge as we look at combustion solutions, which can have climate impacts. You can have partial treatment that can have then harmful byproducts. So when I think of what challenges me, it's that timely identification and then meaningful action. That's where I get very concerned. And especially when a lot of times we will have such a delay that the contaminant becomes ubiquitous, right? Before we actually understand what it is we need to do. And now we have a huge challenge of how we manage cleanup, as well as in getting it out of all of the products such that we can have it from a prevention standpoint. But that's that time delay. That's really what worries me.
Great. And going out to Bruce Allan Gordon from World Health Organization. I don't know if this gives you a different perspective, a full global perspective on this kind of question. I wonder, do you sleep? If you have that kind of perspective of everything going on around the world.
Yeah, the first thing that I think keeps all of us up at night from a global perspective is 2 billion people drinking water that's fecally contaminated. And really things are getting worse by some measures. Cholera is now there's been a 50% increase that we're currently seeing in outbreaks over from now, but based compared to the last 5 years. So I think we also deal with these emerging contaminants, and they take a tremendous amount of resources to deal with because of the complexity. And there's a number of challenges associated with them. But one of my concerns is this balance of trying to understand what are, the true risks to public health, or the more significant risk to public health based and kind of trying to kind of play that against ones that may be lesser. But within the realm of kind of contaminants, emerging contaminants, I would say what I would worry about is ones with similar mode of action that are in mixtures, for instance, where we're looking at a sort of an overall, total toxicity perspective, because we have this contaminant by contaminant approach, which we know is not really helping us when thousands of these substances are working in a similar fashion. So we don't really have a great risk assessment model. I would say, there's some linkages also, I have to say, with antimicrobial resistance as well. So some of these pharmaceutical residues, there's some questions about that. Climate change, cyanotoxins, there's a whole list. So I'm worried about a lot and trying to sleep. Over.
So just to quickly follow up, because I sense a common thread here is just the lack of knowledge. Dr. Rose said lack of monitoring, which to me means we don't have enough information. Dr. Banni, you talk about awareness or lack of awareness and so on. And all of you seem to touch on that. I mean, why don't we have this information? I mean, we've been dealing with these kind of pollutants for at least 30, 40, 50 years. Is there something that you can identify for why we don't have that information, Dr. Rose?
Yeah, I think that our monitoring programs are very fragmented. So we have, and we've also used indicator systems for quite a long time, and they are not adequate. And what really struck me is how fast, during COVID, the laboratory capacity was built around the world to monitor for SARS in wastewater. So we have the molecular tools. Now we have advanced tools to look, more specifically into especially the pathogen pollution problem that Bruce and I are talking about. And but if you look at the databases that people can access, that they can use for decision making, they're quite inadequate. They're very fragmented, and so I think that's part of the problem. And thinking, well, gosh, we're in the information technology era. We really should be doing a better job gathering the data that we are, the monitoring data we do have, but even there we're lacking.
Which means we don't have consistency between organizations. We don't have connectivity. It really comes down to that communication and sharing. And from a global basis, how well are we sharing that information such that we can move forward together, as opposed to everybody's looking at their piece of the world. And then it becomes very complicated then as you're companies that are trying to make decisions on what they need to do. And you've got a regulation in one country that you don't have in another. In the United States, you can have it in one state, not in another state. And so that becomes, again, I think a challenge of how well are we sharing that information so that globally we're making decisions together and moving forward, as opposed to very, again, fragmented, as you say.
Interesting. So it strikes me, I mean, especially when Bruce was talking about all these different contaminants and problems and concerns, and this now, this coupled with this lack of information, lack of awareness, lack of knowledge. How do we manage and get a handle on so many emerging pollutants? And how do we prioritize? How do we go about deciding where we should start or what we should focus on? Let me start with Bruce.
Well, I don't know if this is playing the devil's advocate, but I mean, especially when thinking about low resource countries, if we see national standards with, over 100 parameters, that immediately sort of raises an alarm bell about how can these actually be, meaningfully monitored and enforced. So I think that there is a need to simplify. And of course, we would say, okay, well, simplify based, on public health, on hazards to human health, on exposure. But I think that's not necessarily easily done, especially in this very contentious discourse of emerging contaminants, where there's a lot of public concern about specific ones, PFAS, for instance, which dominates the news. So I do feel like what we need to do as far as priorities is, and maybe getting back to what Joan was saying, but just we need to monitor intelligently, in a catchment where there is where there's some, we need to understand what chemicals and contaminants are in that catchment, and then monitor a few of them, the highest priority ones. Over. So
it's going to be location specific.
I think absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, except there's maybe 4 or 5, where we should be across the board monitoring. Yeah.
Cindy, from an industry perspective, I mean, is this a market issue to try to define priorities, or is there something else?
I think we have to always take it back. I think Joan's comment to begin with, you're thinking of people who have a loss of life or have an adverse impact on their health. And so we have to treat this as a health and environmental concern. And so we have to have regulatory agencies involved, and we have to make decisions. And I think to that comment that Bruce made, we want to monitor and we want to know as much as possible, because we want to make sure we make good decisions. And we always have risk, because it's shown in the past, we can make a decision and then have a byproduct that was worse than what we started with, or some other substitute chemical that becomes a challenge. But we've got to be able to move faster. We've got to not seek perfection at times. And I know that this happens in the private space. We need to be able to move quicker. We need to be able to be more aggressive in setting solutions and moving them forward. And I think that's one of the challenges that I see right now is we have to be able to monitor faster, be able to make decisions quicker, have those databases available such that we can implement solutions. But one of those recurring limitations that I see right now is better detection. And lower detections and testing ease, like how we get that in place such that you can get this information to happen faster. It was interesting, Bruce, your comment of the water's getting, worse. And I've thought about this for a long time. And it is one of those of, I've always tried to think through, like, is it worse or do we know more, right? Because zero isn't zero anymore. And so we keep going to greater detection limits. We find more things. We've cleaned up a lot, but we're now into that space of it's a nitty gritty trying to get this done. And it's going to add a lot of complexity. And so how you can start to have a partnering between the public and the private companies to institute more funding, to be able to test more, to be able to have greater detection, lower detection limits, testing ease. How are we finding a space to be able to help move that faster? Because no one entity can do it alone. Regulations can't do it alone. Government entities can't do it alone. Private industries can't do it alone. We really have to find a much better collaboration to be able to move faster forward faster.
I mean, on the note of regulation, really, is it because the regulatory space is often just running behind the private sector, right? In terms of components that are being monitored and that then suddenly appear in the environment that no one knew of before. PFAS is the perfect example, with now new surfactants being replaced and then somehow ending up in the environment and just being as toxic as the old ones. So how do we get regulators ahead of the private sector? Is it an issue of saying, okay, guys, you can't put any new components out there without proving prior to the launch of these components that they don't do any harm? And we have that kind of regulatory approach in some countries, or is it something of really assigning the kind of private sector finance also in the stewardship to water resources and the environment at large? How do we get to that space where we are faster, like you said, Cindy? Maybe Gordon, also you can comment on that.
That's a tough question.
When Cindy was talking, I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but when Cindy was talking, I was just nodding because my notes, I'm just thinking.
Seem to have lost
we
Bruce
lost
a little
Bruce.
bit.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
Joan, please.
Yeah,
offer a pragmatic.
Oh,
sorry, Bruce. We lost you for about 20 seconds there. So if you want to repeat your. No. Yeah.
No, he's still on mute.
Bruce is, yeah. Please, Joan,
well,
go ahead.
From a regulatory standpoint, we've often, compliance monitoring isn't always the best approach for risk assessment. So I believe in the risk assessment process, that framework. And I really think that's a framework that should be adopted, understanding the hazard, its life cycle. We're not going to be able to monitor everywhere either. Monitoring can be expensive. So we have new analytical tools and modeling that support some of this in terms of transport and fate. And I do think the industry could do more upfront, for some of these contaminants. So, and they have to play their role. But from, if we talk about all the hundreds of pathogens that come from wastewater, we're talking about a long-term investment, 50 to 100 years of investment of infrastructure and addressing recalcitrant contaminants like nutrients that are causing these hazardous algal blooms. This is all exacerbated, of course, by climate change, because we know that these events, these big events and high precipitation events, they're moving the contaminants around. So we also have to invest in these models, work within a consistent framework, use adaptive monitoring programs. And I think it's really, it can't just be compliance monitoring for the zero anymore. And I think we really have to share the monitoring burden. And that means that industry has to do their part. Communities have to invest in their monitoring. Even citizen science can be very valuable now if we gather that information. So I think, we have to think about this collectively as a shared responsibility to really look at our water resources and the protection of our water quality. Because I agree with Bruce. I think we're seeing a degradation of our water quality around the world. And we think that we only have 50%, something like that, Bruce, 56% of the world's wastewater is treated. That's, with more people, you can guess that it's getting worse.
I just wanted to make a comment to what Joan
Please.
said on the climate change. And I don't think we really understand that ramification, because I think it's huge in how we're going to be transporting contaminants, but also how contaminants are showing up in different places. So you look at the drying climates and the lakes that are drying, Salt Lake City, for example, or Great Salt Lake, that it is now contaminants are coming out because as the lake is drying, all of the sediment that's been in is now coming into the air. And so things that we didn't even realize we had to deal with, now we have to deal with very rapidly, because it's going to have rapid health impacts. And we've seen that in other lakes that have dried up. So we're fighting fires on all fronts around us. It's a 360-degree firefighting, and that's what becomes so challenging. How you prioritize is very difficult.
Yeah. Dr. Banni, we have you back. So did you want to try again?
I'm really sorry. Yes, I'm here. So, one of the most important things that we have to do now is to define some criteria. In each country, and this is the crucial point for me. Let's take the case of Tunisia, where I am, and also in US. The norms are not the same. And for example, in Tunisia, we have this direction and this orientation to the waters for irrigation. And one of the problems that we have now is the highly contaminated wastewaters that will directly impact soil quality when used for irrigation. And then one of the aspects that we have published recently, the presence of the fruits, event. And we have, I think, to define thresholds for everything in terms of water quality. One of the things that have been mentioned also is the toxicants. And I don't agree with this prioritization, because simply you will have everything in the water. And most probably one of the aspects that shocked me in my research is that plastic particle will serve as vehicle to a lot of chemicals. And then in water, you will have this combination. And this combination will not allow us to find a process chemical. But the mixture of them is what we have, and we have to deal with.
Okay, and to stay, thanks, Dr. Banni, for that. And to stay with you, so you spent a lot of your time also working with plastics, as I understand, and that maybe also reflects to some extent, because it's also more in the public arena out there, as to how do we go about prioritizing what is the role of prevention or rethinking products as to really treating and cleaning up the mess that we've made. Where do you see room at large for emerging pollutants to prioritize efforts there? Is it maybe not so much a treatment question, or is it also a lot about redesigning products and rethinking life cycles as a whole?
Yeah.
And maybe Rose can also respond to that after you.
Yeah, please, Dr. Rose.
Yeah, I you know, Kristen, you asked about the idea of can policy catch up, but I do think that policy is always going to lag because it needs, it needs science, and there needs to be good science and data as we make policies that could be long lasting and applicable and implementable and all of that. So I feel like we're always going to lag behind in our policy. And that's why I think that collectively there has to be a way to say philosophically, we do want more testing by the industry. We know more. And I do think we're going to have to use models and things like that. I love these mapping models that are available because you can use them at different scales. I think Cindy mentioned the global to the local scale. Some of these models, we can actually map where we think contaminants might be, where we think hotspots might be, and then do selective monitoring and strategic monitoring. But I do think prevention, at least from my perspective, for chemical contaminants, I think we could do a lot better job in terms of pre-testing, and especially the environmental aspects. And we have frameworks for that. Is it soluble? How is it transported? So I do think there should be more upfront testing, thinking about this transport and fate, and thinking about the life cycle. And even with pathogens, they're thinking about wastewater and hundreds of these pathogens. We can still map that. We can map pathogen emissions into at the global scale now. We have the ability to do that. And I think we should use more of those tools and approaches to take a look at what's happening around the world and from a local perspective to a global perspective.
So others want to jump in on this issue of prevention versus treatment and how we balance the two, because I think we also have to think about progress and development. We want these new products and ideas and substances, but at the same time, we have to balance, how do we deal with them carefully? So treatment versus prevention. Bruce?
I'm going to come down very heavily on the prevention side. Let's think about it. At the end of the day, who's bearing the treatment costs, right? So if a company is producing, whatever material X that leads to contaminant Y, and then it's ultimately the science, trundles through and gives a value to a regulator regulates. There's a water supplier that has to ultimately cover the cost of treatment, which is ultimately borne often by a consumer. And I'm not sure that's an equitable thing. And then there's a lot of unequitable things happening there, because then you got aquatic ecosystems being influenced. You probably have quite a, I would say a non-cost effective and non-sustainable way to do things. And many of these things can't be treated. And I forget who was mentioning wastewater treatment. At the end of the day, I think it was Cindy, maybe this is just going into the soil again if it's treated. They have to do something with their effluent or with that. So when Joan mentioned, sort of risk management, preventive risk management, at the end of the day, one of the things I feel like the model is all wrong that we have now, which is this endpoint monitoring. And if we wanted to be preventive, and say you have a water supplier that's looking to have a clean catchment, do they have to beg and plead to all the stakeholders influencing the catchment quality to lessen their impacts? Or should there be some regulations in place there so that the treatment isn't borne by a narrow unit of whether it's government or private over? Yeah.
And do you think this is a lack of awareness also on the public servant side? Hashtag microplastics. You had the microbeads in cleaning products as a popular example, right? That's prohibited in the UK now. So you don't have like microbeads in washing products now anymore. Why are not all policymakers passing this kind of regulation? Where's the gap there? Why does this take so long if it's rather obvious and has been done before?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, the process for policy making, like I said, I think that it's very slow in some places. And for the United States, there's this, you know, for some policies, you have to do a cost benefit. And you know, I always think about, you know, even these low risks, and maybe plastics are low risk, but just like mad cow's disease was probably low risk in hamburgers, but the solution was easy. The solution was easy to stop, you know, feeding, you know, animal feed with byproducts, you know, organ byproducts, to prevent it going into the food chain. And so the public does want these policies when the solution is easy, even though the risk may be low. And so I think it is a lack of awareness, and you know, the rest of the world catching up to say, hey, they did it over there, it's very easy to do, you know, and we should be doing this globally. And I think, and oftentimes we don't have a voice. We don't have the collective voice for the environmental policies that we need, that are strong, that the public can hear, right? They hear the local news and they get very weary. You know, we just look at COVID and SARS. You know, the public gets very, very weary of hearing these messages, you know, year in and year out. So I think that we have to have these, you know, a collective voice. I think we have to, again, this shared knowledge. And I do think it happens eventually, but it is too slow often, you know, in terms of implementation. I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah, I think to your point, to this global perspective, different countries have the ability to implement at different speeds, right? It can be a function of the type of government that they have and their ability to influence. And so you have some that are going to be very slow, very cautious, don't want to make too big of a quick, you know, make a quick decision. It has an impact on business, and they're maybe very pro-business. And so you start to run into, I think, other balances or differing objectives on how you manage that. And so a country that can make a decision very quickly, maybe it is the way that they can implement policy and the way that they are government's role in that country. And that can be very different in another location. So I think that becomes that challenge of government, big business, trying to be able to manage what the public wants. Your point, Joan, is absolutely spot on. The public is worried, but public education is absolutely critical, because the consumer is the one that's going to drive change many times over when they reach a point. But how do you get them to that point that they say enough is enough and I want this change? And then they can drive government and they drive business. So it's a real difficult challenge of really kind of what's the chicken, what's the egg?
I do think too that these organizations, and Bruce, maybe you want to add to this, or Christian, even you, I do think organizations like the World Health Organization, World Bank, very influential, right? And strong voices that help the global community come together and talk about guidance and how, you know, really how to look at some of this through a risk framework and a preventive framework, and what type of investment is needed, you know, by the local governments or the national governments to address some of these emerging contaminants.
If I can put just one word with this regard, if we can consider one case study, which is the Mediterranean area, it is shared by North Mediterranean country, Europe, with a high speed, let's say, level in terms of policymakers and so on. But also you have the North African country that they are sharing the same space, but moving with a very low speed. So here we are in the same environment, but moving with two speeds. In Europe, we have a very high speed in terms of decision maker and so on. and in South Mediterranean area, we have another speed. But unfortunately, we cannot coordinate this task between countries that have, even if we have some collective activities in the set of the Mediterranean Parliament and so on, but not really effective, let's say. So what you just say is true, but we need also to focus on the real situation in one ecosystem, and the Mediterranean is very impacting. So North Mediterranean country, South Mediterranean country, we haven't the same, let's say, decision makers in terms of speed. And this will pose a lot of problem because it is the same environment but with a lot of, let's say, two speeds. This is the idea.
Bruce, you wanted to jump in, I thought?
Yeah, no, thanks. It was also just, Jonas stimulated me to say something I'm very honest about. Maybe I'd see a little bit of a change in terms of how we deal, at least how I'm sort of our units dealing with some of these contaminants. I think it's no longer enough, for us to be able to produce a guideline value or say this is a threshold of risk for regulators, because that is, it's not dealing with these upstream issues. They're wanting to know a broader WHO position on whatever it might be, microplastics. There's exposure from food and air and everything else. And so that's taken out of context often, that kind of narrow guidance to the regulator. So I guess what I'm trying to say is all the things we're talking about, we're realizing as an institution, we have to deal with like international plastic treaty negotiations. We have to deal with things like single-use plastic bags and, sort of pharmaceutical, those microbead things. It's not enough just to talk about, oh, well, you know what, we just deal with the risk from ingestion from drinking water. And that's where we need to go, because none of this is going to move at the level of, drinking water treatment and regulation.
Yeah, that goes back to the point of completing priorities, right? I mean, you're not going to worry about microplastics so much if you're dealing with a cholera outbreak. There's just a whole different urgency there. I'm gonna pick a question from the audience. So Gabriel, did you have another follow-up?
No, that's exactly. I thought we should move on and engage with the audience here, because there's been a number of questions posed in the chat. So Chris, please. Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to pick a question from Adek Benro Peter. And he's asking, as part of the efforts to prioritize emerging contaminants, I think there's a need to also identify and assess the risks from chemically transformed byproducts arising from these chemical pollutants. So my question is, what measures are being taken to address this concern? An example here would be ozonation, I suppose. There are potentially a lot of subproducts then that go out into streams and the environment that have different implications that we may not even be monitoring. So maybe Joan, also from a life cycle perspective of pollutants, maybe you have some response to that.
Ooh, yeah. I think that is a difficult one, and I'm not an expert in the chemical arena, and maybe Cindy or Bruce can address this as well. But I do like the idea of these industry alliances that are at a higher level, at a global level, where there's a community of practice in terms of, and I saw that there was another question that it's pretty naive to think that the industry is going to take on this role of testing, but I do think that there is, this approach with some of the larger companies, the global companies, to create alliances like the Plastic Alliance, in which you could say this is the appropriate practice we want by our community, and try to hold them accountable for pre-testing. And that does mean that they need more scientists from our educational, pipeline that are understand these transformations. A lot of times we don't know. We get caught, as Cindy said in the very beginning of her opening statement. We didn't know this was going to happen. And so I think, we have so much more awareness now, and having those types of scientists hired by the industry and trained so that they are looking at transformation products and that type of thing. But I know that's not a very adequate answer to the problem, but I think it's probably complex.
I think to some of your points there does become a point of accountability, and currently it doesn't probably feel like there's much accountability, right? Then, you look at the whole PFAS situation, and there's a lot of perspectives of this is very, very difficult to clean up. It's extremely expensive. Why is it being borne by the public? Because the public is the one having to deal with it. And yet we know where the PFAS comes from. We understand the sources of it. So why isn't there accountability back to being able to have those companies help pay for these expensive costs that many communities cannot afford to do? And so I think it is a good point. The naivety, there is that concern. But I also think at some point you're going to have this blend of private companies, manufacturing companies are going to have to realize that for the decisions that they make, they are going to have an accountability, that they are going to have to bear that cost. That if they are not being honest, if they are not doing the appropriate testing, if they are not considering both the chemical constituent, but also byproducts that may come from some of those treatment processes in what they're doing to them, and they're still going forward on that product, they haven't shown that at least that they have gone through this testing. They have to have some accountability. Now, driving that is going to be really, really hard, driving it on a global basis, because you look at some of the challenges, this is a global element. It's a forever chemical. It's everywhere. And how do you drive that accountability? And I don't have the right answer for that, because, Gabriel, you made a point earlier. We don't want to slow down progress either. We want new products. We are trying to encourage things that to be done better, though, right? So how do we drive that better element in solution development such there's an accountability element that stays with that company if they're making choices without the proper research and understanding of their products?
Chris, do you want to move on to is another question in the chat, or in the Q&A?
Yep, no, I was just waiting if some others would like to comment on that. So there's another question on the gender component of also emerging pollutants. I think that's multifaceted in many ways. The question is gender considered when examining the impact of emerging pollutants, as women are mostly responsible for domestic water tasks in many areas of the world, collecting water, etc. So I suppose it goes into the direction of them also being oftentimes the very first ones that are being exposed to contamination. And then, of course, there's a component of endocrine disruptors, I may add, that has a different effect, probably more heavily on women, and the effects go towards pregnancy and childbearing and whatnot. Would some of the panelists like to comment on that? Is that gender component in the emerging contaminant discourse?
Well, all I'll say is that I do think that we need more women in the profession and at the table in the decision-making process. They do have a different perspective. Some of them have, I always recall a conversation by a colleague at the global level, and she was the one representative at the table, and they were trying to decide about where to put wells, what distance within this community to make water accessible. And she said, have any of you ever carried water, at the table? And all the men said no. And she's like, well, guess what? I have carried water, and that's too far. The well should be closer. And so we need more women scientists, women educators, women in chemistry, in the industry, in government. We need more women at the table because they do bring that perspective. And so I'm a big supporter of that type of influence, I think, especially through the decision-making process.
Thanks, Rose. And Bruce, you wanted to come in on that as well?
I was as the male, one of the males on the panel, I was going to come in. No, first fully agree with Joan, and that's supported by, we did just a month ago, we produced a report that also looked at the role of women in water management. It was very low in terms of, professionals at water companies and suppliers, and in terms of having a voice in local, community participation. So, I mean, I do think, honestly, when I think about the gender aspects, I do think about, burden of water carriage, even musculoskeletal, kind of issues. But at the end of the day, I'm sure there's issues maybe with emerging contaminants. But I think that the most important is to get women in decision-making roles so that they can protect and advocate for, their communities.
Indeed.
Well,
Gabriel, go ahead.
Anything else in the Q&A, or I have a couple other questions that I might want to throw out to the panel. We have just a few more minutes here.
I think there's one more, but we can save that one for later.
Please go ahead.
Right. Going forward, UN Water Conference in March, is emerging pollutants, contaminants, is that something that any of you are having on their agenda and are going to prioritize? And if so, in what way? For example, WHO, big topic also for water.
Well, I mean, I could jump in on that one. And just to give you the context, part of that conference involves an interactive dialogue between member states and other stakeholders to talk about water issues. And the first thematic dialogue was on water and health. So together with UNICEF, we kind of coordinated a background paper. It's about 10 pages long. And yes, indeed, there's elements, or there's a section that deals with emerging contaminants. But some of the feedback that we got also was to try to make sure that the issues that were most significant for human health were also, made clear they were most significant for human health. And so this is part of a big and broad issue where we're dealing with everything from some of these serious microbial contamination issues that are, a continuing concern and maybe getting worse in some areas, all the way through, to, impacts of climate change, and just indeed water supply, and the human right to water. So it's part of, I would say it's part of a broader story, but it's definitely there.
Would you say there's any synergies around cleaning up emerging contaminants and fixing or addressing existing bottlenecks around access to water and sanitation supply?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's a concern that, a water service provision alone isn't adequate. I mean, it needs to be continuous. It needs to be of high quality, and and so when you think about that second point, there's so much that does depend on prevention, because many suppliers and community supplies don't even do, essential disinfection. There's not even chlorination. So if we're able to tackle pollution prevention in the context of waste, human waste and industrial waste or whatever, then that helps everyone. It's just win-win. Right. So I think that's why we've got to go as upstream as possible. And even on plastics, again, is it that inconvenient for someone to buy their food, in cardboard rather than having it wrapped in plastic or whatever it might be, or going to the cheese counter and instead of, having a prepackaged, piece of food, because it's, there's many, many ways that, it all kind of interrelates over.
Yeah, I hope that, some of the dialogues, the publications that are going to come out. I mean, it's been how many years? Some 30 years or something, where there's been something focused just on water. And so I think this conference in March is really, really important I hope it gets the attention, the media attention and political attention it deserves. And I hope that there can be a discussion more about this one water aspect, this idea that the waters are connected, and we're talking about, when we talk about water and water security, water quality, we're also talking about, wellness and food security. And so I'm hoping that there will be a lot of attention paid to one water concept. And quantity, of course, is going to be on everybody's mind. Climate change is going to be on people's mind. But I hope that water quality gets its due attention in this regard, and in particular, because as Bruce mentioned, it's so connected to health and health of the planet, by the way, and health of our economies and on and on. So,
any other comments on this from the other two panelists? If not, I think, Chris, you had one final question for everybody.
Okay, are we already that late in the session? Yes.
We
then
have, yeah, yes.
Then I have one question. We want to do a one-word kind of answer. Yeah. So keep that in mind. And the question is really, what for you is the most effective way to prevent the release of emerging pollutants into the environment? Just one word comes to mind, whether it's treatment, prevention, etc. I'm going to start with Joan.
just one word, rats. I'm going to say treatment, but wastewater treatment.
Great, thanks. Bruce, you want to go next?
Need to unmute.
I'm just going to have to say prevention. I know it's not original.
Okay, Cindy?
I'm going to say accountability.
And Mohamed, please.
Well, in one word, it's very difficult, but I want to say awareness, because behind the awareness, we can act.
Great, thanks. And I think that sums it all up really well. And of course, it's not just one item or one piece of the puzzle. So treatment, prevention, accountability, and awareness do all need to come together. Thanks for that. Very comprehensive.
Looks like
over to you,
keywords
Gabriel.
for an abstract, yeah.
Yes.
No, it's great. It's great because I think it actually captures, I mean, most of what you all focused on in this session. This is a challenging issue that we're tackling here, and you know, one of the challenges is here we want to be positive about it. We don't want to just be negative. And so all these concepts of treatment and awareness and prevention and so on, I mean, these are things we can take forward into sort of a positive light, and to try to do something positive with this. So I know we're going to be running out of time. We still have about 4 or 5 minutes, but is there real quickly because we have about 5 minutes, I see on the clock. If you had just a quick wrap up from each of you that you wanted to sort of leave us with before we finish. Let me start with Cindy first.
Thank you. Well, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate all the different perspectives, and it's such a complicated subject that we all have our own perspectives, and we need to bring it all together to be able to make change. And so I think one of the elements, and Joan mentioned it earlier, but I do think we need to keep pushing back harder, is this public education. So it goes to Mohamed, your point on awareness. You know, how much are we letting consumers understand that the products that they're using, that the exposure routes that they're being exposed to because of the choices that they're making, such that they will want to make different choices, such that they're going to push back on the private sector for change. And I think that we've got to do more on the education. All of these other pieces are really important, but there's so much of the public who doesn't really think twice about some of the choices that they make in their daily life and understanding its ramifications, both to their own health, but also to the environment. So how we ramp that up to make sure that we have that education, that people see the role they play, is, I think, really, really important. And we can't just go back to thinking that government will figure it out, policy that will make a change, that the private sector will respond. You need the public to push harder.
Thank you. And let's move on to Mohamed El Banni. Last words.
Really, thank you very much for this very kind, let's say, conversation about this hot topic, contamination. I will be back to the word that I said before, but now Cindy just mentioned the increasing awareness and education. And in one of my projects dealing with plastic in the environment, we have a special section to schools and how can students from elementary to university act in terms of participation to this, let's say, consortium. I would just stress one word. Please, let's consider the mixture of contamination in one ecosystem, in water, not only the single compound. This is very, very important from a toxicological point of view. And thank you very much for this very nice opportunity.
Thank you. Joan Rose.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think we have the technologies we need right now to implement a better monitoring program globally. We have molecular tools available. We have the ability to use the models and mapping now. And so I think using that power and with the power of information technology, we should do a better job of informing, putting out the data and informing not just the public, but the policymakers and local community leaders in regard to water quality. So I think we have the capacity to do it, and I hope that we move that forward.
Thank you. And Bruce, you have the last word.
Well, I agree with my panelists, and I think we all kind of touched on this word of education, and I like that a lot, because I feel like at the end of the day, there's a lot of complexity here. I mean, driven by, analytical detection that is getting to, kind of detect substances, very low concentrations. I think there's a lot of confusion. But I like what you said, Gabriel, about just being positive and optimistic, because at the end of the day, this is prevention and treatment and managing water and sanitation better are highly cost effective. So, at the end of the day, if we put money into this and we change behaviors, then ultimately society will actually save money from averted healthcare costs, from whatever, and it's quite substantive. So I don't think we should be so scared of doing the right thing, because at the end of the day, it's going to help all of us as a society.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I want to really thank all four of you for this engaging conversation and really sort of diving into some of these difficult topics and being willing to share your experiences and your backgrounds, your knowledge with everyone. I want to thank Chris for helping to moderate this panel, Tatiana, who's doing the rapporteuring. Thank you, the audience, for your engagement, for your questions, we're collecting all these responses and all the questions that have been submitted. There's other questions that we haven't gotten to, and any remaining questions that we have received, we will place, if we are able to get answers from the panelists, we'll put them on the conference website. We also want to remind everyone that you can see an excellent selection of submitted conference posters online at the IWRA onlineconference.org. Please do take a look at those posters. There's some really wonderful, wonderful contributions here. And just look for the tab that says posters on that website. If you have any questions on the posters, you can send an email to online.conference@iwra.org, and we will connect you to the poster author, and they can respond to any of your queries. And please, let's keep the conversation going with all these experts, with all of you who are participating today. You're all in the field of water. You're all interested in these emerging pollutants. And we've set up a platform that with the Global Water Partnership, and it's there in the chat. Please join us in this conversation. We're going to keep going beyond just this 3-day conference, and hopefully we'll continue to engage on this. Thank you, everybody. And I think we're going in about 15 minutes, we're going to go to the closing ceremony. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. That was super interesting.